Some storms don't destroy houses. They destroy the conversations people thought they still had time for. The snow came down hard over Manhattan, thick and relentless, swallowing the streets beneath layers of white that reflected the city lights like broken glass. Wind slammed against the windows of Whitmore Tower, nearly 40 stories above Lexington Avenue, rattling the massive panes with a low, haunting groan. Ethan Whitmore stood alone in his office, staring at the storm with both hands in the pockets of his charcoal overcoat. Behind him, the glow of muted television screens flashed market updates no one cared about tonight. His $12 million merger had just collapsed 3 hours earlier. Investors were furious. Reporters were already circling like vultures. But none of it bothered him as much as the storm itself. Ethan hated snowstorms. Always had. The kind of hatred that lived deep in the bones. The kind that returned every winter no matter how much time passed. He loosened his tie slowly, exhaustion pulling at the sharp lines of his face. At 38, Ethan Whitmore had become the kind of man magazines admired. Billionaire CEO, youngest chairman in company history, ruthless negotiator, brilliant strategist, the man who could rebuild collapsing corporations with a single phone call. But tonight, standing alone in the silence of his office while snow buried the city below, he looked less like a powerful executive and more like a tired son who hadn't slept properly in years. His phone vibrated again across the desk. Another message from his assistant. Another emergency meeting request. Another crisis demanding attention. Ethan muted the device without reading it. Then he grabbed his coat and left the office without saying a word to anyone. Outside, Manhattan looked abandoned. Yellow taxis crawled through slush-covered streets while pedestrians disappeared beneath umbrellas and heavy coats. The storm blurred headlights into soft streaks of gold and white. Ethan drove himself downtown for once, something he rarely did anymore. The windshield wipers fought desperately against the snow while jazz hummed quietly through the speakers. At a red light near 54th Street, his eyes drifted toward a woman helping an elderly man cross the sidewalk. She held his arm carefully despite the freezing wind. Calm, patient, unhurried. Ethan looked away almost immediately. He didn't know why small acts of kindness irritated him lately. Maybe because they reminded him of things he no longer had time for. 10 minutes later, traffic stopped completely near a side street in Midtown. Horns echoed uselessly through the storm. Ethan exhaled sharply, turned the wheel, and pulled beside a narrow café glowing softly beneath an old green awning. The sign above the entrance flickered in the snow. Bennett's Coffee House. Warm amber lights spilled through the fogged windows. He almost kept driving, but something about the place felt still, quiet in a way the rest of the city wasn't. Ethan stepped out into the freezing wind, snow immediately dusting his black coat and dark hair. The cold hit hard enough to sting his lungs. By the time he pushed open the cafe door, the bell above it rang softly through a room filled with the smell of coffee beans, cinnamon, and fresh bread. The warmth wrapped around him instantly. Inside, only 4 customers remained. A college student asleep beside a laptop. An exhausted nurse warming her hands around tea. An older couple sharing pie near the window. Soft piano music drifted through hidden speakers while the storm growled outside like a living thing. Ethan removed his gloves slowly, scanning the room with tired eyes. That was when he noticed her. The waitress moved quietly between tables carrying a tray of coffee mugs with both hands. Blonde hair tied loosely behind her neck. Black sweater beneath a dark apron. No makeup except the natural flush from the warmth inside the cafe. But there was something unusual about her calmness. The storm outside seemed unable to touch her. Kitchen closed 20 minutes ago, said an older man behind the counter apologetically. But coffee's still hot if you'd like some. Ethan nodded once and slid into a booth near the window. Snow pressed softly against the glass beside him. A moment later, the waitress approached carrying a ceramic mug. "Rough night to be out," she said gently. Her voice was warm, without sounding rehearsed. Ethan barely looked up. "I've had worse. Most people say that right before the storm gets worse." A faint smile touched her lips as she placed the coffee down carefully in front of him. Steam curled upward between them. Ethan finally looked at her directly. Her name tag read Clara. Blue eyes. Calm posture. No nervousness at all despite recognizing exactly who he was. Most people did, especially in Manhattan. But Clara Bennett simply stood there waiting patiently, like his money meant absolutely nothing inside these walls. "You staying open all night?" he asked. "As long as people need somewhere warm." Ethan glanced toward the nearly empty cafe. "That can't be profitable." Clara looked toward the window where snow buried the sidewalks deeper by the minute. "Not everything is." Then she turned quietly and walked away before he could answer. Ethan stared after her longer than he intended to. Outside, the storm continued swallowing the city inch by inch. But inside the small cafe, the lights glowed softly against the darkness, while somewhere near the counter, Clara Bennett hummed quietly to herself as she poured another cup of coffee. The storm deepened as the night dragged on. Snow swirled violently through the streets outside Bennett's coffee house, covering abandoned cars and burying sidewalks beneath nearly 8 inches of fresh snow. The city sounded different during storms like this. Quieter, softer. Even Manhattan's endless noise seemed to surrender beneath the weight of winter. Inside the cafe, warm yellow light reflected against the windows while jazz piano drifted lazily through the speakers overhead. Ethan Whitmore sat alone in the corner booth, one hand around the ceramic coffee mug that had long gone lukewarm. He should have left 30 minutes ago, maybe an hour. But every time he reached for his gloves, something stopped him. Perhaps it was the weather. Perhaps it was exhaustion. Or perhaps it was the strange calm that existed inside this little cafe while the rest of his world continued collapsing somewhere beyond the snow. Clara Bennett moved quietly between tables, collecting empty plates and wiping down counters. There was nothing dramatic about the way she worked. No exaggerated smiles. No desperate attempts to impress customers. She simply carried herself with a kind of quiet steadiness Ethan had almost forgotten existed. The older couple near the window stood to leave first. The man struggled into his heavy coat, while his wife adjusted a knitted scarf around his neck with gentle hands. Clara walked them to the door, carrying 2 paper cups. "For the road," she said softly. "The hot chocolate is extra sweet tonight." "You are too kind, sweetheart," the woman replied warmly. Clara smiled. "Drive slow. The bridges are icing over already." Ethan watched the exchange over the rim of his coffee mug. No charge. No expectation of tips. Just kindness offered naturally, like breathing. He looked away before she noticed him staring. A loud gust of wind rattled the windows hard enough to make the sleeping college student jolt awake near the back wall. The young man looked around in confusion while his laptop screen blinked weakly beside him. "You can stay as long as you need," Clara told him gently while setting fresh coffee beside his elbow. "Subway service is suspended anyway." "Seriously?" the student groaned. Clara nodded sympathetically. "Storm warning got upgraded 20 minutes ago." Ethan frowned slightly and checked his phone. No signal now. The storm had swallowed that too. For a moment, the realization irritated him more than it should have. No calls, no emails, no meetings, no constant demands clawing at his attention every 30 seconds. Just silence. He had spent years building an empire large enough to control entire markets. Yet tonight a snowstorm had disconnected him from all of it with embarrassing ease. Clara reached the old radio near the register and adjusted the volume slightly as weather reports crackled through static. "Mayor is advising everyone to stay indoors until morning," the announcer warned. "Visibility near Central Park has dropped below 100 feet. The nurse near the counter sighed heavily into her tea. "Looks like I am sleeping at the hospital tomorrow." Clara leaned against the counter sympathetically. "What floor?" "Pediatrics." Clara's expression softened instantly. "Then those kids are lucky to have you." The nurse smiled tiredly. "That might be the nicest thing anyone has said to me all week." Ethan glanced toward Clara again. She had a way of making people feel seen without trying too hard. It unsettled him more than arrogance ever could. Most people approached Ethan Whitmore carefully. They wanted something. Investment opportunities. Connections. Approval. Even simple conversations usually carried invisible price tags attached beneath the surface. But Clara spoke to everyone the exact same way. The nurse. The student. The older couple. Him. Equal warmth. Equal patience. Equal distance. The lights flickered suddenly overhead. Once. Twice. Then darkness swallowed the cafe completely. A few startled voices echoed softly through the room before emergency backup lights clicked on near the ceiling, bathing everything in dim amber shadows. Outside, snow continued falling endlessly beyond the glass. Perfect, the student muttered. Clara remained calm. Transformer probably overloaded nearby. She moved behind the counter and lit several candles from a drawer beneath the register. Small flames slowly warmed the darkness table by table until the cafe glowed softly like something from another lifetime. Ethan watched her move through the shadows carrying candlelight in both hands. Calm, unhurried, almost peaceful. Then it happened. Near the counter, a little girl sitting beside her exhausted mother began crying softly. Maybe 6 years old, frightened by the darkness and the storm outside. Her tiny hands clutched a stuffed rabbit against her chest while tears rolled down flushed cheeks. The mother looked embarrassed. "I am sorry," she whispered tiredly. "She hates thunder." Clara crouched beside the little girl slowly. "You know what my grandmother used to say during storms?" The child sniffled quietly. Clara smiled gently and brushed loose blonde hair behind one ear. Then softly, almost under her breath, she began to sing. The melody floated carefully through the candlelit cafe. Slow, delicate, old-fashioned. A lullaby wrapped in warmth and memory. Ethan froze instantly. The coffee mug slipped slightly in his hand. His heartbeat stopped for one impossible second. Because he knew that song. Not just knew it. Remembered it. Deeply. Painfully. His mother used to sing it beside his bed during snowstorms when he was little. Every winter. Every single storm. Ethan stared at Clara across the dim cafe while the melody drifted through the darkness like a ghost returning home. The melody lingered in the cafe long after Clara stopped singing. Soft. Fragile. Like something too old to survive in a city this loud. The little girl slowly stopped crying, her tiny fingers loosening around the stuffed rabbit while her exhausted mother whispered a grateful thank you. Around them, the cafe returned to silence beneath the low hum of emergency lights and the distant howl of wind outside. But Ethan Whitmore could not move. His chest felt tight in a way he had not experienced in years. The candle beside his coffee flickered softly, reflecting against eyes that suddenly looked much younger than 38. He knew every note of that song. His mother used to sing it during storms exactly like this one. Back when he was still small enough to believe bad weather could not reach him as long as she was nearby. Ethan remembered the old townhouse in Connecticut. The sound of firewood cracking in the fireplace. His mother sitting beside his bed with a wool blanket wrapped around her shoulders while snow tapped gently against the windows. She always sang quietly. Never perfectly. Sometimes she forgot the words halfway through and laughed softly before starting over. But she always finished the melody. Always. Ethan swallowed hard and looked toward Clara near the counter. She was pouring fresh tea for the nurse like nothing unusual had happened. Like she had not just reached into the deepest locked part of his memory without even realizing it. The old radio crackled again through static. More road closures. More warnings. The storm showed no signs of slowing. Ethan stood slowly from the booth, barely noticing the untouched coffee left behind him. His polished shoes crossed the wooden floor while the candlelight stretched long shadows across the cafe walls. Clara glanced up when he approached. "Do you need a refill?" she asked gently. Ethan stared at her for one silent moment too long. "That song." Clara tilted her head slightly. "What about it? Where did you learn it?" Her expression shifted almost invisibly. Not fear. Not exactly surprise either. More like caution. Clara looked down briefly as she folded a dish towel carefully beside the register. An old woman used to sing it. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest again. Who? Clara hesitated. Outside, wind slammed against the windows hard enough to shake the hanging lights above the counter. "Someone I knew a while ago," she answered quietly. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. He was not used to vague answers. Entire industries moved because people feared disappointing him. Employees spoke carefully around him. Investors answered questions immediately. But Clara Bennett simply stood there calm and unreadable beneath warm candlelight, like she owed him nothing at all. "That song is not common," Ethan said. "Trust me, I would know." Clara studied him for the first time that night with genuine attention. Not because he was famous, not because he was wealthy, but because something in his voice sounded different now. Softer. Human. "Maybe memories make songs feel rarer than they are," she replied gently. Ethan looked away toward the storm outside. Snow swirled endlessly beneath the streetlights, while distant sirens echoed somewhere uptown. "My mother used to sing it," he admitted quietly. Clara's hands stilled against the counter. "Used to?" He nodded once. She died during a storm 10 years ago. The cafe fell strangely silent after that. Even the jazz music overhead seemed quieter somehow. Clara lowered her eyes briefly before speaking. I am sorry. Ethan almost laughed at the simplicity of the words. Thousands of people had offered condolences after Margaret Whitmore passed away. Politicians, business leaders, reporters with carefully rehearsed sympathy. But none of those words ever sounded real. Clara's did. Maybe because she said them softly instead of dramatically. Maybe because she did not know she was speaking to one of the richest men in New York when she said them. The nurse gathered her coat nearby, while the college student yawned heavily beside his laptop. Life continued quietly around them, while Ethan stood frozen inside a memory he had spent years trying to bury beneath work and ambition. What was her name? He asked suddenly. Clara blinked once. The woman who taught you the song. A long pause followed. Then Clara looked toward the candle flickering beside the register. Margaret, she said softly. Ethan stopped breathing. Completely. The name hit him harder than the storm outside. Harder than the failed merger. Harder than any loss he had survived in the last decade. Margaret. His mother's name. Not common. Not impossible either. But combined with the song. Ethan stared at Clara while old memories crashed through him one after another. His mother humming beside the piano. His mother singing during long drives through snow-covered roads. His mother waiting at the dining room window long after he stopped visiting regularly, because meetings always seemed more important. Margaret what? He asked quietly. Clara looked almost uncomfortable now. I never knew her last name. Ethan's heartbeat pounded hard enough to hurt. Where did you meet her? Clara glanced toward the clock on the wall as though debating whether to answer at all. Then she folded the towel once more and spoke carefully. At a nursing home in Brooklyn. Ethan's face drained of color. Because his mother had spent her final months in a private care facility in Brooklyn after her illness worsened. A place Ethan rarely visited near the end, because every conversation with her became harder than the one before. Clara noticed something changing in his expression then. The controlled billionaire sitting alone in her cafe suddenly looked less like a powerful CEO and more like a son hearing a familiar voice in the dark after years of silence. Outside, snow buried Manhattan deeper beneath the storm. But inside Bennett's coffee house, Ethan Whitmore felt the past slowly opening its eyes. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The storm continued roaring beyond the windows while candlelight trembled softly across the cafe walls. Ethan Whitmore stood motionless near the counter, staring at Clara Bennett as though the entire world had suddenly narrowed into one impossible conversation. Margaret. Brooklyn nursing home. The old song. Every piece landed inside him with terrifying precision. Clara noticed the color drain from his face. Are you all right? She asked quietly. Ethan blinked once, almost like he had forgotten where he was. What was the name of the nursing home? Clara hesitated. St. Elias Care Center. Ethan lowered his eyes immediately. That was the place. Exactly the place. A cold weight settled deep in his chest. He remembered signing the paperwork himself. Private suite. Around-the-clock care. The best doctor's money could provide. At the time, he convinced himself it was enough. More than enough. Because work demanded everything from him back then. Meetings in Tokyo. Acquisitions in Chicago. Investors in London. He told himself success would give his mother comfort. Security. Pride. He just never noticed how empty her eyes became every time he said he was too busy to visit. Clara studied him carefully now. The sharp businessman who entered the cafe earlier looked completely different standing beneath dim emergency lights. Smaller somehow. Human. You knew her, Ethan said quietly. It was not a question anymore. Clara folded her arms lightly against the cold draft creeping beneath the front door. I volunteered there during college. Ethan looked up slowly. College? Clara nodded once. Nursing program. That surprised him. You are a nurse? Not anymore. Her answer came too quickly, like a door gently shutting before he could see inside. Ethan noticed that, but tonight felt too fragile for pushing. Instead, he glanced toward the snowstorm outside, while memories slowly returned one by one. His mother sitting alone beside hospital windows. Her quiet smile every time he arrived late. The way she always defended him even when disappointment lived plainly in her eyes. Ethan had not thought deeply about those memories in years. Work was easier. Numbers were easier. Grief became manageable when buried beneath 20-hour workdays and billion-dollar negotiations. But now an old lullaby had cracked something open inside him. Clara reached for the coffee pot and refilled his mug silently. Steam curled upward between them. "She talked about you a lot," Clara said softly. Ethan looked up sharply. "She did." Clara nodded while wiping the counter absent-mindedly. "Mostly during storms." His throat tightened. "What did she say?" Clara smiled faintly, though sadness touched her eyes. "That you hated snow ever since you were little." Ethan almost laughed at the accuracy of it. "She remembered that?" "She remembered everything about you." Those words hit harder than anything else that night. Ethan looked away immediately toward the flickering candles near the windows. He had spent years convincing himself illness had taken most of his mother's memory near the end. It made the guilt easier somehow. Easier to believe she would not notice his absence if she barely remembered what day it was. Clara continued quietly. Every Friday evening, she would sit near the piano room waiting for visitors. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Friday nights. The nights he almost always canceled because board meetings ran late. "She used to wear this dark blue sweater," Clara said softly. "Said it was your favorite color when you were a kid." Ethan swallowed hard. He remembered that sweater. Cashmere. Navy blue. He bought it for her during a business trip to Boston nearly 15 years ago before life became so complicated. Before every conversation between them started feeling rushed and unfinished. The nurse near the counter quietly gathered her things to leave while the college student slept again with his head resting against textbooks. The café had grown almost dreamlike beneath the storm. Time moved differently here. Slower. Softer. Clara glanced toward Ethan carefully. "She was proud of you." Ethan laughed once under his breath, but there was no humor in it. "She should not have been." Clara frowned slightly. "Why would you say that?" Ethan stared down into the dark coffee. "Because I missed too much." The honesty surprised even him. Men like Ethan Whitmore did not admit regret out loud. Not to strangers. Not to themselves. But something about Clara made lies feel exhausting. "The week she died," Ethan continued quietly, "I was in Switzerland closing a deal." Clara said nothing. "My assistant called 3 times that morning." His voice lowered further. "I silenced the phone because I was presenting to investors." Outside, wind screamed down the avenue hard enough to shake the glass again. Ethan barely noticed. "By the time I called back," he stopped there. The sentence unfinished, but painfully clear. Clara lowered her eyes gently. Not pity. Never pity. Just understanding. And somehow that felt worse. Ethan rubbed tired hands across his face before speaking again. "I built an empire because I thought success would make her proud." His voice cracked slightly beneath the weight of exhaustion and memory. "But I think she just wanted dinner with her son once in a while." Silence settled softly between them after that. The kind of silence that does not demand filling. Clara reached beneath the counter slowly and pulled out a small object wrapped carefully in cloth. Ethan frowned slightly as she placed it gently beside his coffee mug. An old cassette tape. The plastic edges worn with age. A faded handwritten label stretched across the front in shaky cursive letters. "Storm Songs." Ethan stared at it without breathing. Clara's voice became almost a whisper. "Your mother asked me to keep this safe." Ethan stared at the cassette tape like it might disappear if he blinked too hard. The worn plastic reflected candlelight softly while snow continued falling outside Bennett's coffee house in endless white waves. Storm Songs. His mother's handwriting. He recognized the gentle curve of the letters instantly. Margaret Whitmore used to label everything carefully. Old recipe cards. Christmas decorations. Birthday photos stored in faded boxes upstairs. She always believed memories deserved names. Ethan reached toward the cassette slowly, almost cautiously, as though touching it might reopen something he had spent years trying to survive. His fingertips brushed the cracked edge of the tape. Real. Old. Fragile. Just like the sound of her voice had become inside his memory. "She gave this to me about 6 months before she passed," Clara said quietly. Ethan looked up immediately. "Why?" Clara folded her hands together lightly against the counter. "Because she was afraid you would never hear these songs again." The words landed softly. That somehow made them hurt more. Ethan lowered his eyes toward the cassette once more. His mother always worried about strange things near the end. Tiny things. Human things. Whether the flowers near her window got enough sunlight. Whether the nurses remembered to eat lunch during long shifts. Whether Ethan was sleeping enough. He used to think those conversations were pointless. Distractions from larger problems. bigger responsibilities. But standing here tonight beneath dim cafe lights while the storm buried Manhattan outside, Ethan suddenly realized those tiny conversations were the entire point. Clara reached beneath the counter again and carefully placed an old portable cassette player beside him. "It still works most of the time," she said gently. Ethan let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "I have not seen one of these in 20 years. Margaret refused to use smartphones. A faint smile touched Clara's face. She said buttons disappearing from phones was the beginning of society collapsing. Ethan stared at her for one quiet second. Then unexpectedly, he smiled too. Small, brief, but real. That sounds exactly like her. Clara sat down slowly on the stool behind the counter while Ethan turned the cassette over carefully in his hands. There was another handwritten note on the back. For snowy nights. His throat tightened instantly. He remembered snowy nights. His mother making grilled cheese sandwiches at midnight when storms knocked out the power. Her old record player humming softly through the house. Her voice singing while she folded laundry near the fireplace. Memories Ethan had buried beneath conference rooms and private flights and quarterly earnings reports until they barely felt real anymore. He inserted the cassette slowly into the player. The machine clicked softly beneath trembling fingers. Then static filled the cafe. Old static. Warm static. The kind modern technology erased years ago. Ethan closed his eyes automatically. A soft crackling sound followed. Then her voice appeared. Testing, testing. Oh Lord, I sound terrible. Clara smiled quietly across the counter. Ethan stopped breathing. Margaret Whitmore laughed softly through the cassette speakers. Ethan used to say I sing like a tired goose during winter. Ethan covered his mouth instantly with one hand as emotion hit him harder than expected. Because he remembered saying that. Age 7. Snowstorm outside. His mother pretending to act offended before chasing him around the kitchen with flour on her hands. The recording continued. If you are listening to this someday, sweetheart, then it probably means there is snow outside. Ethan stared at the cassette player while the cafe disappeared around him. Her voice sounded older than he remembered. Softer too. Fragile in places. But unmistakably hers. I figured storms should not feel lonely after I am gone, Margaret said gently through the static. So I wanted to leave a little music behind. Ethan lowered his head slowly. Clara looked away politely, giving grief the dignity of privacy. Tonight, I met a lovely girl named Clara. Margaret continued warmly. Ethan's eyes lifted immediately toward Clara. She looked embarrassed now. She brings me tea even when she is not supposed to. The recording said. And she listens better than most people in this world. Clara shook her head faintly like she still could not believe Margaret had recorded this. She reminds me that kindness still exists in quiet places. Ethan watched Clara carefully then. The calm way she carried herself. The patience in her voice. The steadiness in her eyes. His mother had always been unusually good at seeing people clearly. Better than him. If you ever meet her someday, Ethan, Margaret's voice continued softly. Be kind to her. The world gets heavy for people like that. Silence filled the cafe after the recording clicked softly to an end. Outside, snow drifted slowly beneath streetlights while the storm finally began losing some of its anger. Ethan remained completely still, one hand resting against the cassette player, eyes fixed somewhere far beyond the counter. Clara spoke quietly after a long moment. She talked about you constantly. Ethan swallowed hard. Even near the end? Clara nodded. Especially near the end. He laughed once under his breath, but grief hollowed the sound. I did not deserve that. Clara looked at him carefully. People who love deeply rarely stop loving just because they are disappointed. Ethan stared at the candle between them while those words settled slowly inside him. For years he believed success could repair absence. That expensive hospitals and private nurses somehow compensated for missed dinners and canceled visits and rushed phone calls cut short by meetings. But tonight an old cassette tape had exposed the truth with unbearable simplicity. His mother never wanted more money. She wanted more time. The lights flickered suddenly overhead, then fully returned. Brightness flooded the cafe all at once. The storm outside had finally weakened enough for power crews to restore the block. Ethan blinked against the sudden light, while Clara stood to switch off the candles one by one. The moment felt strangely symbolic, as though something buried in darkness had quietly found its way back. Ethan looked down at the cassette player once more before speaking softly. Thank you for keeping this safe. Clara smiled faintly. I think she always believed you would eventually walk through that door. The storm finally began fading sometime after 2 in the morning. Snow still drifted gently through the streets outside Bennett's coffee house, but the violent wind had softened into something quieter now. Manhattan looked strangely beautiful beneath the fresh blanket of white. Clara wiped down the espresso machine carefully while Ethan sat near the counter beside the cassette player, staring at nothing for long stretches of time. He had replayed his mother's recording 3 times already, not because he needed to hear it again, because he was afraid of forgetting the sound once the night ended. Clara noticed the untouched coffee beside him. "You have not taken a sip in 10 minutes, she said gently. Ethan looked down at the mug like he had forgotten it existed. "Sorry. You apologize a lot more than I expected." That almost made him smile again. "People usually expect worse from me." Clara folded a towel neatly beside the sink. "Are they wrong?" Ethan leaned back slowly against the stool, loosening his tie for the second time that night. "Most days? Probably not." Clara studied him quietly. The expensive coat draped across the booth behind him probably cost more than her monthly rent. His watch alone could pay for the entire cafe's repairs twice over. Yet none of that seemed important tonight. Beneath the wealth and reputation, Ethan Whitmore looked profoundly tired. Not physically, soul tired, like someone who had spent too many years running in the wrong direction. "Margaret used to worry about you," Clara said softly. Ethan stared at the counter. "I know." "No," Clara replied gently. "Not the way you think." He looked up. Clara smiled faintly while rinsing ceramic mugs beneath warm water. "She never worried about your money or your company." Steam curled softly around her hands. "She worried because she thought you stopped letting people take care of you." Ethan looked away immediately. The accuracy of it stung. "When someone spends too long being needed by everyone else," Clara continued quietly, "they eventually forget how to be human outside of responsibility." Ethan exhaled slowly through his nose. "You sound like a therapist. Nursing school teaches you things." "You never answered why you stopped." Clara's hands paused for the smallest moment before continuing again. "Life changed." Simple answer. Closed door. Ethan recognized that kind of response because he used them constantly himself. He nodded once without pushing further. Silence returned comfortably between them for a while. Not awkward, not forced, just quiet. Outside, a snowplow crawled slowly down the avenue, leaving clean dark tracks through the white streets. Ethan watched it through the window while old memories continued surfacing whether he wanted them to or not. "I missed her birthday once," he said suddenly. Clara glanced over. Ethan rubbed tired fingers across his jaw before continuing. "Her 72nd birthday." His voice sounded distant now. "I promised I would fly back from California in time for dinner." Clara listened without interrupting. But a deal went sideways. He laughed softly at himself. "Funny thing is I cannot even remember what company we were acquiring anymore." The jazz music drifted gently through the cafe. "But I remember her voicemail." Ethan stared toward the falling snow. "She tried to sound cheerful. Said she saved me cake in the fridge." Clara lowered her eyes quietly. "I called her back 2 days later." The words hung painfully in the warm air between them. Ethan swallowed hard before speaking again. By then she pretended it did not matter anymore. Clara walked slowly around the counter carrying a fresh pot of coffee. She refilled his mug carefully before speaking. "People who love deeply become very skilled at hiding loneliness." Ethan stared into the rising steam. "You always talk like that." Clara smiled softly. "Only after midnight." He let out a quiet breath that almost resembled a real laugh this time. Then his eyes drifted toward her hands. Small scars near her wrist. Faint but noticeable beneath the cafe lights. Nurse training. Hard work. Long shifts. He noticed details more tonight than he usually allowed himself to. Clara leaned lightly against the counter. "Margaret had this little ritual every Friday." Ethan looked up again immediately. "What ritual?" "She would ask me to wheel her near the window around 6 o'clock. Clara's voice softened further. "Then she would smooth her sweater and fix her hair." Ethan felt his chest tighten. "Why?" Clara looked at him carefully before answering. "Because she thought maybe you would surprise her and walk through the door." Silence. Heavy and endless. Ethan lowered his eyes slowly toward the cassette tape still resting beside him. Suddenly, every canceled visit replayed differently in his memory now. Not as unavoidable business obligations. Not as necessary sacrifices. But as empty chairs beside windows. As untouched birthday cakes. as old women fixing their hair before disappointment arrived quietly at sunset. Clara saw the grief crossing his face and gently changed the subject. You know what her favorite thing was? Ethan shook his head slightly. Diners. He blinked once in confusion. Clara laughed softly. Not fancy restaurants. Not galas. Diners. Even Ethan smiled faintly at that. She loved terrible coffee and blueberry pie. That sounds right. Clara nodded. She used to say expensive places made people forget how to talk honestly. Ethan stared down at his coffee while emotion pressed heavily against his chest again. Because the small cafe around him suddenly felt exactly like something his mother would have loved. Warm lights. Real conversations. Snow outside. Human beings slowing down long enough to notice each other. Clara glanced toward the windows as the first pale hints of dawn began touching the edge of the sky beyond Manhattan. Storm is finally ending, she said quietly. Ethan followed her gaze. Morning was coming, and for the first time in years, he realized he was not ready to leave. By 6:30 in the morning, the storm had finally loosened its grip on the city. Manhattan slowly returned to life beneath pale winter sunlight that reflected across snow-covered streets like silver glass. Cars moved carefully through slush while bundled pedestrians stepped cautiously around frozen sidewalks. Inside Bennett's coffee house, the warmth remained soft and quiet. The nurse had already left for the hospital after thanking Clara 3 separate times for staying open through the night. The college student disappeared shortly after sunrise, carrying textbooks beneath one arm and an exhausted smile on his face. Now only Ethan and Clara remained inside the nearly empty cafe, while fresh coffee brewed softly behind the counter. The exhaustion in Ethan's face had not disappeared, but something else had changed. The sharp tension he carried when he first walked through the door was gone. In its place sat a quieter kind of heaviness. The kind people carry after finally telling themselves the truth. Clara wiped down the last clean table near the windows while sunlight stretched pale golden patterns across the wooden floor. Ethan watched her silently for a moment before speaking. Did my mother ever talk about my father? Clara glanced up in mild surprise. Sometimes. Ethan nodded slowly. He died when I was 12. Clara leaned lightly against the back of a chair while listening. Heart attack. Ethan continued quietly. One minute he was shoveling snow outside our house. The next, his voice faded naturally. Clara lowered her eyes gently. That was when you started hating storms. Ethan looked toward the window where snow still clung to parked cars outside. My mother spent the next 20 years trying to make winter feel safe again. A faint smile touched his face briefly. Every storm she baked something. Blueberry pie, Clara guessed softly. Ethan blinked in surprise. How did you know? Clara laughed quietly. Because she talked about it constantly. That made him smile again. Small but genuine. She always burned the crust. She blamed the oven every time. Ethan let out a soft breath that almost sounded peaceful for the first time all night. Then silence settled between them again while Clara gathered empty mugs from nearby tables. Ethan watched her carefully now. Not just the graceful way she moved through the cafe, but the details beneath it. The tiredness hidden behind calm eyes. The precision in her hands. The way she automatically straightened crooked sugar packets while thinking. There was history there. Quiet history. You really loved nursing, did you not? He asked gently. Clara paused beside the counter. For the first time since he met her, uncertainty crossed her expression. I did. Ethan waited. Clara folded the dish towel carefully before continuing. I was finishing my residency at St. Vincent's downtown. Her voice remained calm, but softer now. Then my father got sick. Ethan listened quietly. Cancer. One simple word. Heavy enough on its own. Clara looked toward the window as sunlight reflected softly in her blue eyes. Everything happened very fast after that. Ethan understood immediately. Hospital bills. Long nights. Impossible choices. I left school to take care of him, she said quietly. By the time he passed away, I could not afford to go back. The cafe fell silent again except for the soft hum of the espresso machine. Ethan stared down into his coffee while guilt twisted sharply in his chest for reasons he could not fully explain. He spent millions on private jets without blinking. Entire companies survived because of his investments. Yet somewhere in this city, someone like Clara Bennett lost her future because life became too expensive to survive kindly. I am sorry, he said quietly. Clara smiled faintly. Funny thing is, my father apologized to me more than anyone else did. Ethan looked up slowly. For what? For getting sick. The sadness in those words lingered heavily between them. Ethan leaned back slightly against the stool, studying the woman standing across from him beneath soft morning light. Most people he met wore ambition loudly. They advertised intelligence, success, importance. Clara never did. Yet she carried more quiet strength than executives twice her age. Margaret used to tell me something, Clara said softly while adjusting the coffee machine. She said grief changes shape depending on whether you were present or absent when someone needed you. Ethan lowered his eyes immediately. Clara seemed to realize the weight of her own words a second later. I did not mean that cruelly. I know. Ethan's voice was calm, tired, honest. That is why it hurt. Outside, snow began melting slowly along the sidewalks as the city awakened fully around them. Ethan checked his watch automatically out of habit. 8 missed calls, 12 unread emails, 3 emergency meeting requests. For once, none of it felt urgent anymore. He locked the phone screen again without answering. Clara noticed. Big company crisis? Probably. You should go save the world then. Ethan looked at her for one long, quiet second. I think the world survives without me more often than I realized. Clara smiled softly at that. Then she disappeared briefly into the kitchen before returning with a small white bakery box tied carefully with blue ribbon. She placed it gently in front of him. Ethan frowned slightly. What is this? Blueberry pie. He stared at the box in surprise. Clara shrugged lightly. The crust is probably burned. For the first time that entire night, Ethan laughed fully. Quiet, but real enough to warm the room around him. Clara smiled too, though something emotional flickered behind her eyes watching him finally let go of some invisible weight. Ethan reached for the box slowly. You did not have to do this. Clara looked toward the snowy window while morning sunlight touched the cafe walls softly around them. Maybe not, she said gently. But your mother would have. Ethan looked down at the blue ribbon resting against his hands while emotion rose painfully in his chest again. Because after years spent surrounded by wealth, assistants, investors, and carefully polished conversations, a tired waitress in a little coffee shop had somehow given him the one thing money never could. A moment that felt like home. The morning crowd arrived slowly after the storm. Construction workers with snow-covered boots. Office employees carrying frozen umbrellas. Parents rushing children toward school buses delayed by icy roads. Bennett's coffee house filled again with the familiar sounds of spoons against ceramic mugs and quiet conversations drifting through warm air, scented with coffee and cinnamon. Yet for Ethan Whitmore, everything felt strangely different now. He remained seated near the counter long after sunrise, the untouched blueberry pie box resting beside him, while Clara moved calmly through the growing crowd. Nobody inside the cafe seemed to recognize him anymore. Or maybe they simply did not care. Oddly enough, Ethan found comfort in that. Clara greeted every customer the same way she greeted him the night before. Calm smile, warm coffee, quiet kindness without performance. An elderly man struggled to count change near the register, apologizing softly as coins slipped from shaking fingers. Clara simply covered the rest without mentioning it. A young mother entered carrying a crying toddler wrapped in winter clothes. Clara brought warm apple slices to the child before the woman even ordered. Ethan watched all of it silently. Small moments. Tiny acts no headlines would ever celebrate. Yet somehow they carried more humanity than most boardrooms he had sat inside for the past 10 years. His phone vibrated again across the counter. Rebecca, his assistant. 5th call in 20 minutes. Ethan stared at the screen before finally answering. Mr. Whitmore, Rebecca said immediately, relief flooding her voice. Thank God. We have been trying to reach you all night. Ethan rubbed tired fingers against his forehead. I know. The investors moved the emergency meeting to 9:30. Everyone is waiting for your decision regarding the merger response. Ethan glanced toward Clara as she laughed softly with a little boy near the pastry display. Reschedule it. Silence answered him for 2 full seconds. Sir, push everything until tomorrow. Rebecca sounded genuinely stunned. Tomorrow. Ethan almost smiled at how impossible the idea seemed to her. Ethan Whitmore never delayed meetings. Never postponed crises. Never disappeared during negotiations. Yes, he said calmly. Tomorrow. He ended the call before questions could follow. Clara looked over briefly while carrying fresh coffee toward a table near the windows. World still ending? She asked lightly. Ethan slid the phone into his coat pocket. Apparently, it can survive 24 more hours. Clara shook her head with quiet amusement before returning to work. Around 11 o'clock, the lunch rush slowed enough for silence to settle softly through the cafe again. Snow melted steadily along the sidewalks outside, while pale winter sunlight reflected against nearby buildings. Ethan finally stood from the counter, holding the blueberry pie box carefully in one hand. Clara noticed immediately. "Leaving?" she asked. Ethan nodded slowly. Eventually, something unreadable flickered briefly through Clara's expression. Disappointment, maybe. Or simply the quiet understanding that some people are only meant to pass through certain places once. Ethan reached inside his coat pocket and removed a black card holder before stopping himself halfway. Clara noticed the hesitation. "What?" she asked gently. Ethan looked down at the platinum business card between his fingers. Normally, this solved everything. Opened every door. Created opportunities instantly. But suddenly offering it to Clara felt wrong somehow. Transactional. Like reducing this entire night into another exchange between powerful man and struggling waitress. So instead, he slid the card back into his pocket. Clara watched him curiously. Ethan glanced toward the cassette tape still resting beside the coffee machine. "Would you let me borrow it for a few days?" Clara smiled softly. "I think Margaret would like that." He nodded gratefully. Then his eyes drifted toward the old, upright piano standing near the back corner of the cafe. Worn wood. Slightly crooked bench. Dust gathered near the pedals. "Does anyone play that?" he asked. Clara followed his gaze. "Sometimes." "You?" A faint blush touched her cheeks. "Not well anymore." Ethan studied the piano quietly. "My mother used to play every Sunday morning." Clara leaned lightly against the counter. "Margaret told me." Silence settled again between them. Comfortable now. Familiar. Ethan realized with strange clarity that he had not felt peaceful around another person in years. Not because Clara tried to impress him. Not because she wanted anything from him. But because she allowed silence to exist without needing to fill it. His phone buzzed once more. Another emergency. Another demand. Ethan ignored it completely this time. Clara noticed. That important? Probably. Then why stay? Ethan looked toward the snowy streets outside the window. Because I spent too many years leaving places too early. Clara lowered her eyes softly at that. A few moments later, the cafe door opened suddenly and cold air rushed inside. A delivery driver carried in several boxes of fresh supplies while apologizing for delays caused by the storm. Clara hurried over to help him lift them near the kitchen. Ethan watched her struggling slightly with one heavy box and stood immediately without thinking. "I have it," he said. Clara blinked in surprise as he carried the box easily toward the back storage shelves. The delivery driver nearly dropped his clipboard, recognizing the billionaire CEO standing in a tiny neighborhood cafe, carrying coffee supplies like an ordinary employee. Ethan barely noticed. Clara smiled faintly watching him return. "You know," she said softly, "most billionaires probably do not spend snow days unloading milk crates." Ethan brushed melted snow from his sleeve. "Most billionaires probably do not spend snow days getting life advice from waitresses either." That made Clara laugh fully for the first time since he arrived. Warm, unfiltered, real. The sound lingered softly through the cafe like sunlight after a long winter. Ethan looked at her quietly afterward, suddenly understanding something painful and beautiful all at once. His mother had not sent him wealth before she died. Not power. Not lessons about business. She left him a song. A little coffee shop, and a woman kind enough to keep both alive until he was finally ready to listen. 3 months later, winter returned to Manhattan quietly. Not with violence this time. Just soft snow drifting lazily across sidewalks and rooftops beneath pale evening light. The city moved slower during the holidays. Softer somehow. Even the sharpest people seemed gentler beneath December lights and warm scarves. Bennett's coffee house glowed warmly at the corner of Lexington and 53rd like it always had, though one small thing had changed. Above the entrance, beneath the green awning dusted in fresh snow, a second sign now hung beside the old cafe name. Margaret's Song Night. Every Friday at 7. Inside, candles flickered softly along the windows while customers filled nearly every table. Some came for the coffee. Some came for the pie. Clara still burned slightly around the edges on purpose. but most came for the music. Near the back corner, the old upright piano no longer gathered dust. Every Friday evening, someone played old songs there while the city slowed down long enough to listen. Clara Bennett moved between tables carrying mugs of hot chocolate and fresh coffee, while soft laughter drifted warmly through the cafe. Her life still looked simple from the outside. Same black sweater, same quiet smile, same gentle way of speaking to strangers like they mattered. Yet subtle things had changed. There were nursing textbooks stacked carefully beneath the counter now, enrollment papers tucked beside the register. Ethan Whitmore had discovered through entirely legal but very determined means that Clara secretly reapplied to nursing school weeks after the storm. He also discovered she planned to work double shifts for the next 3 years to afford tuition. Clara never knew why St. Vincent's suddenly offered her a full scholarship funded anonymously through a medical outreach grant. Ethan made certain of that. Near 7 o'clock, the cafe door opened softly as cold winter air swept briefly through the room. Nobody looked surprised anymore. Ethan Whitmore stepped inside, carrying snow across the shoulders of his dark wool coat. No security team followed him now. No assistants. No rushed phone calls pressed against his ear. Just Ethan. Customers near the windows glanced up in recognition, but quickly returned to their conversations. Over the past 3 months, Manhattan quietly adjusted to the strange reality that one of the most powerful CEOs in the country spent every Friday evening inside a tiny neighborhood coffee shop, drinking terrible coffee and listening to old piano songs. Clara looked up from the espresso machine the moment he entered. Her smile arrived naturally now, not cautious anymore. Familiar. "You are late," she said softly. Ethan removed his gloves with a faint smile. "Traffic." Clara raised an eyebrow. "You own a helicopter. And yet somehow New York still finds ways to humble me." That earned the quiet laugh he had started looking forward to every week. Ethan slid into the booth beside the window without needing to order anymore. Clara already knew. Black coffee. 1 sugar. Blueberry pie warmed slightly, even though he always claimed he was too full for dessert. Outside, snow drifted gently beneath glowing streetlights, while jazz music hummed low through hidden speakers. The city looked beautiful tonight, but Ethan barely noticed anymore. Because for the first time in years, his life no longer felt like something happening somewhere else while he rushed past it. Clara carried his coffee over carefully and placed it beside him. "Big meeting today?" she asked. Ethan nodded once. "We finalized the hospital expansion project in Brooklyn." Clara smiled softly. "Your mother would like that." Ethan looked down at the rising steam from his coffee. "I think so too." There was peace in his voice now. Not perfection. Not complete healing. Grief never worked that way. But the sharp edges had softened. The storm inside him no longer howled quite so loudly. Near the piano, an older man adjusted sheet music while couples settled quietly into nearby chairs. Friday night music hour was about to begin. Ethan reached into his coat pocket slowly and removed something wrapped carefully in cloth. Clara frowned curiously as he unfolded it atop the table. The old cassette tape. "Storm songs. I think this belongs here," Ethan said gently. Clara stared at it quietly for a moment. "Are you sure?" Ethan nodded. Memories survive longer when they are shared. Clara looked toward the piano while emotion flickered softly behind her eyes. Margaret would have loved hearing that. Ethan smiled faintly. "I know." A few moments later, the piano player began softly pressing familiar keys. Warm notes drifted through the cafe while conversations quieted naturally around the room. Then Ethan froze slightly as the melody unfolded. The same lullaby from the storm. The same song his mother used to sing during winter nights long ago. Clara had taught it to the pianist weeks earlier. Ethan looked toward her across the room. She stood near the counter listening quietly while snow fell outside the windows behind her. Candlelight reflected softly in her blue eyes. Calm, steady, unchanged by the world's noise. Their eyes met briefly through the warm glow of the cafe. Neither spoke. They did not need to anymore. Some people arrive loudly in life, demanding to be remembered. Others arrive quietly carrying small things. A song, a cup of coffee, a little kindness during a storm. And somehow those are the people who change everything. Ethan leaned back slowly against the booth while the old melody filled the cafe around him. For the first time in longer than he could remember, winter no longer felt cold.